Okay, welcome to video 8. Today we're going to be talking about sexual harassment, what it is, and how it can affect you in the workplace. Alrighty, so let's just jump right into it. I wanted to get a few definitions in. One of those is a clarification of what is sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is in a workplace or other professional or social situation involving the making of unwanted sexual advances or obscene remarks. That's harassment, which is different from sexual assault, and that's unwanted sexual contact or sexual coercion or forcing a person to engage in a sexual act against their will. And those are two different things. They're both serious, but there's some real gray areas in between those two things, especially when it comes to consent and coercion. So, a little bit of the history of sexual harassment in our culture. 2-3 generations ago, sexual harassment was rampant in our industries and businesses and jobs and schools. There was little to no protection for people against sexual harassment, and there were usually no consequences for offenders. Historically, women were not able to avoid sexual relationships with supervisors. College students had voluntary and involuntary relationships with their professors. Harassment wasn't talked about, and the people who complained, who filed a complaint or talked about it, were often fired as a result of their complaint. Interestingly enough, the moderating factor in harassment historically has been the spouses of the harasser, not the companies, not the bosses, but it was more of an internal prevention. Also in the pre-information age, I mean, imagine life without smartphones and without computer screens and without emails and texts and instant messaging. There was really very little way that a person could get proof that they were being harassed. And of course, historically, male on male harassment, female on female harassment, and female on male harassment were not very common at all, where today it is much more common. However, the preponderance of sexual harassment continues to be male on female harassment. Okay. A generation ago, sexual harassment came of age in the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice, and not the one you're thinking of. It was at a time where Clarence Thomas was being confirmed by the Senate for as a Supreme Court justice, and was accused by one of his previous staff members of sexual harassment. And the Senate held a hearing on it, and they decided that the accuser was not telling the truth, and that Clarence Thomas was not responsible for sexual harassment, and he was confirmed onto the Supreme Court. Of course, this came about again a generation later with the most recent Supreme Court appointment of Brett Kavanaugh. So it's become more common in our consciousness on what it costs a person to accuse another of sexual harassment. There are two legal definitions of sexual harassment, and you want to write both of these down. The first one is called hostile work environment. And that's attitudes, behaviors, communications that are considered both hostile in the work environment and sexual. So being hostile towards someone, like saying, hey, you're an idiot, I hate you, is not considered sexual harassment. But if that harassment or bullying takes on a sexual nature, that would qualify as being sexual harassment. Some examples of hostile work environment would include physical touching, groping, although that starts to go over into the area of sexual assault. Frottage, where you stand against, where your body parts touch another person's body parts. Comments, jokes, sexual stories, sexually related posters or emails. The classic snap-on calendar used to be shown in every mechanic's office, would be unacceptable today. Dress that's inappropriate. Staring at someone in a sexual way at work, or soliciting a person for dates or encounters that are unwelcome, all constitutes a hostile work environment. There's a lot more examples. Perhaps you can come up with some of your own. The second type of sexual harassment is quid pro quo harassment. Quid pro quo in Latin means this for that, and For quid pro quo harassment to exist, there has to be a power imbalance between the two people, such as an employer and the staff member that they supervise is a power imbalance. So quid pro quo harassment is essentially favors or punishments that could be implied or traded in order to have sexual activities. Here are some examples of quid pro quo harassment. The boss asks a person to join them at a conference and they book adjoining rooms at the hotel. That puts the staff member in a very uncomfortable situation. Another quid pro quo example would be a professor that asked a student to go out to dinner after class so they can discuss the material. The supervisor gives a lecture or reprimands an employee on the importance of being nicer or being a team player. Or a person could give a performance review saying, hey, your situation here could get better or it could get a lot worse. And they don't necessarily spell out, you must engage in a sexual relationship with me or you will be fired. It's never like that. It's just very implied, but it's very well understood. Again, sexual harassment today is very, very subtle. Because harassment has become so much a part of our culture and we're very aware of it, people who engage in sexual harassment do so in a way that is super subtle. It's hard to pinpoint, the language isn't clear, it could easily be misunderstood. For instance, people will engage in something called fishing, and fishing is where you toss a hook out and you see if anything bites, and if something bites, you reel it in a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. And a person who starts to harass, if they harass and the person who they're harassing is very clear and sets up boundaries, boom, that can get cut off. But sexual harassment, fishing tends to be so slight and so vague that it's really hard to put your finger on it and say, I think I'm being harassed. Sexual harassment, as I said before, is not limited to male on female. There's plenty documentation on female, female on male, and male on male harassment. And it didn't used to be taken as seriously because people would think, oh, that's not really a thing. Well, it is a thing, and 81% of women report experiencing sexual harassment in their careers. 20% of men report experiencing sexual harassment in their careers. That's according to a study by the US government, and it was reported on NPR 2 years ago. So this is a real thing. There is a preponderance of male on female harassment. It's part of our culture, and it's something that we need to be aware of. Okay, so first part is, what do you do if you are being harassed? If you're being harassed, make sure when you start a new job that you read and you follow up on the company's guidelines for sexual harassment. Every large company is going to have a printed guideline. Smaller businesses may not, but that's still a discussion you'd want to have during training. If you're being harassed, confront the harasser in an assertive and unapologetic way. These things, what you said, I don't appreciate it, please stop. Enough said. You don't have to get mad or angry or aggressive, you can just be assertive. If getting mad and angry and aggressive works, do that too. Tell a trusted friend about the harassment. Make sure other people know when it's happening and get as much documentation as you can. Collect evidence, save emails, save texts, save call logs, any kind of surveillance video. Make sure that doesn't get thrown away in frustration. Notify your supervisor. If your supervisor is the person who's doing the harassing, notify their supervisor and notify the human resources director if there is that person in your company. Okay, so that's some things you can do to avoid sexual harassment. What can we do to change the culture of sexual harassment, to really make a difference in our own culture so that we don't have a culture that's accepting of or excusing of sexual harassment? Here's what we can do. We can conduct ourselves as a professional at all times. We can speak in a way that's professional. Our attitudes and communications can be professional. And we set reasonable boundaries in our actions with our coworkers. That also might mean avoiding dating or hooking up with your coworkers, even if it's not a supervisor, even if it's not someone who you work closely with. If you engage in relationships outside the workplace with your coworkers, you put yourself at risk for harassment. And you can also go a long way towards propagating a culture, a kind of a hookup culture within your workplace. And that's probably not going to work out very well in the long run. Sexual jokes, sexual stories, if they're funny to you, they're probably not funny to everyone. And here's the measuring stick that I use with conversation with my coworkers. How does this sound if I have to explain this conversation to my boss? How does it sound if I have to explain this conversation in a sworn deposition? How does that sound? There's your measuring stick that you can use on whether a conversation is appropriate for the workplace or not. Finally, we got harassment in the age of the internet. The internet has had a huge impact on our culture, our attitudes about sexuality, and our attitudes about harassment. New norms are being formed every day. Remember when we talked about culture? Cultural norms are changing around sexuality in the workplace. Thing about emailing funny stories, gifs, jokes, anything like that that's documentation. It can be reproduced. It can be seen by people who you don't want to see. So the rule of thumb is don't send that information electronically over your home or your work computer. It can come back to bite you. Consider every conversation you have and every email that you have and every kind of electronic communication. Consider that it's not confidential. Consider that everyone can and will see that, and that you don't want to have conversations that are unprofessional. Psh, enough said. We got that. Don't forward sexual-oriented jokes in your email. Don't make jokes or innuendo in your emails. They might be funny to you. They might be funny to the person who receives them, but they might not be funny at all to the person who that gets forwarded to, especially if it's your boss. Don't Google anything on your work computer that is of a sexual nature, and don't make up this excuse that you were doing research if you do. And do maintain considerate, polite, professional boundaries with your coworkers. This can and should bring up a long conversation. I'm sorry that we're not able to do this in person, because we could have a great conversation about this. People can talk about their experiences. People can also talk about their experiences when they look back and they say, you know what? I did this and I said this, and now that I'm looking back on it, I don't think it was such a great idea. This is a good conversation to have, and I encourage you to have it. Thanks very much.